and welcome to The Edge. Well, we're taking in-depth analysis of today's top stories by looking beyond the edge. We'll bring you not just the facts, but also deep insights into the topics with expert opinions and social media reactions. Let's make a start with our look beyond the edge. Lebanon is grappling with the worst economic and financial crisis in its modern history, one that the World Bank has said is likely to rank as one of the worst the world has ever seen in the past 150 years. Most Lebanese have seen their purchasing power drop and their savings evaporate. More than half the country's population now lives below the poverty line. Can Lebanon get out of the crisis in the near future? For months, the world has watched a political eviction drama unfold between Israeli occupiers and Palestinian residents. Israeli forces still violently attack and use stun grenades on Palestinians in the flashpoint-occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Al Jarrah. Will the plight of Palestinians end? And what is the international community doing? The second Berlin conference on Libya, co-hosted by the United Nations and Germany, aims to ensure a smooth conduct to the political process that will be concluded by December elections. Crucial decisions will be taken during the conference. These are the top three stories that we'll be taking a look at today from Beyond the Edge. Let's get started. Lebanon, a country that has gone through more than its fair share of crises in the last few years, has been marred by street protests and confrontations for months. Let's have a look at how the situation has deteriorated over the last year alone. Lebanon is in the throes of a deep economic meltdown that's threatening the stability of the country. The worsening economic and social crisis has been termed as one of the deepest depressions in modern history.
Lebanon is in a deeply prolonged economic and political crisis that puts its weight on the shoulders of the citizens as each day is worse than before. Daily life has been changed in 1 year amid the rapid collapse of the currency following a political paralysis in forming a new government to deal with one of the deepest depressions in modern history, as described by the World Bank. According to the latest World Bank Lebanon Economic Monitor report, the economic and financial crisis in Lebanon is likely to rank in the top 10, possibly top 3, most severe crises episodes globally since the mid-19th century. On Tuesday, Lebanon's Ministry of Economy and Trade raised the price of subsidized bread for the 5th time in a year, as the country's multiple crises worsen with no resolution in sight. It added that the reason behind the latest increase, 18% from the last raise in February, was due to the central bank's ending of sugar subsidies, which in turn adds to the cost of bread production. In 2020, food and goods prices soared by 145% on average. Some goods were up 200%, which harshly affected the purchasing rate that staggered 90%. The majority of the Lebanese, around 60%, are poor, 22% of whom are below the extreme poverty line, and this average will be increased with the lifting of the central bank support for basic items. Lebanese people have to sit in long queues for hours to get oil for their cars. Basic necessities such as food and medicines are in low supply. All these hardships add to the worsening plight of the people in general.
And I'm joined live from Tripoli in Lebanon by Obaida Takriti, who's a member of Citizens in State, and from Beirut in Lebanon by Nizar Ghanim, who's an economic policy expert and representative of Lebanese Depositors Union. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me here today on The Edge. Obaida, let me start with you. The bread crisis is a particularly interesting place to start, and I think shows just how badly the currency has devalued over the last 18 months. I read that after 10 years, for the first time, there was an increase last June of 30%, and now there's been 5 more increases. What does this tell us about the actual state of the economy for people living a day-to-day life in Lebanon?
You were showing some pictures also in the videos from Lebanon about what's happening. But if I want to describe it, you have people who doesn't have food on their tables every day. You have people without any electricity or generator. But what's more upsetting is when you see the minister, for example, of Transportation and Public Affairs, stating that he and also the ruling authority doesn't really care about all the people, especially the people who cannot afford the living with this devaluation. So he stated that the government should withdraw its support on oil, and in this case, the fuel will be ranked around 200,000 Lebanese lira, which is unaffordable for any people in this country, unless for the people who can afford it and who can still hold this burden. So I believe what's upsetting more is that the ruling authority and the current government doesn't even care about the people who are afraid now, who are uncertain, and who in every second maybe would take a choice to go violently on the street and face the current government. In this case, we are going into KAYIS. If we keep telling the same story as well, we will be all not only upset but traumatized by the current situation. But I believe there is still hope to get out of the current free fall that we are facing.
Nizar, so Obaida describes the situation as a free fall. Is that the reality? And how can this free fall be stopped?
Good evening, everyone. I mean, definitely we are in a state of a free fall. In the absence of a true sustainable macroeconomic stabilization framework, we're going to a scenario of larification, which is similar to Argentina. It means there's a scenario of hyperinflation, years of economic turmoil and political instability. And as Depositors Union, I mean, we hold the government and the political class that actually rules the parliament responsible. What they've done is completely criminal. To protect the interests of a fraction of Lebanese elites, they've basically destroyed the whole economy. I mean, without an IMF plan that brings back some sort of a legitimacy internationally, where Lebanon can borrow money, can implement a true economic and political reform, we are destined to destitution, to become at par with some sub-Saharan African countries. It's a disaster in economic terms.
So, and signs of that disaster, as you mentioned earlier, Obaida, are the lack of electricity. And my colleagues who's from Lebanon was telling me about how it's difficult for mothers to get milk for their children, let alone medicines. These basic things are what the Lebanese people are struggling for. So how do people cope?
You know, I was asking the same question the last few months. And I think it was different because the necessities were different in this case. Because if you take, for example, Ramadan as a case study, where people from abroad supported Lebanese to get their food mainly, But when you have a problem of electricity and fuel, which is something that no one actually can support unless the state itself decided to import such thing. So I believe that's why the problem is exceeding the ability actually for people who for expats, for people even who have money inside Lebanon to actually face the current crisis. So that's why we are always calling for a transitional government that can actually take these tough decisions that the current authority wouldn't take actually. So I believe we are now getting into a phase where any kind of support, whether from NGOs, whether from charity organization, whether from wealthy people, wouldn't actually solve the problem. So I believe without the intervention of a transitional government who can actually take this decision, we are going also into more crises in the coming days.
Nisa, I want to come back to you. One of the questions that's been weighing heavily on me is, with all this terrible situation in Lebanon, how are people getting by on a day-to-day basis? I assume that that it's not that the jobs situation is in a very bad situation. Are people able to work? And if they're not able to work, how are they able to get money so that they can pay these super inflated prices?
No, definitely. I mean, the unemployment is skyrocketing. We're speaking about an economy that is shrinking by the second. Especially that Lebanon relies heavily on service economy, and with Corona, it also took a big hit. I think for the time being, what the citizens are doing is using whatever savings they can get from the banks. Negative coping mechanisms. We're speaking about people starting to sell their assets. We're speaking about a collapse of a real estate sector. Even the price of lands have decreased. So basically, people are resorting to negative coping strategies. And this shows that we are, in fact, there's also increased theft, increased crime. So definitely and this is why really the Lebanese are not demonstrating. I think many are in survival mode now. For sure that I think one aspect of resilience in Lebanon remains the remittances coming from abroad. So many Lebanese families also have people abroad which send them sufficient amount of money to actually survive. Also, we can say that the political class that has basically in a scenario of this meltdown, instead of paying the price in a just manner, where the state is a place where you can actually divide losses, what the elites did, they took all their money out. Mm-hmm. The middle class and the working class has suffered tremendously, and now what they're doing is they're bringing back the money to sustain their clientele's networks, which means again like parties like Hezbollah, like the main political blocs that rule the country, they give their supporters money, $100 a month, and in that sense sustain and pacify the protest movement.
So there's like I was going to say social security network, but that's not exactly what it is. But you refer to
that actually is collapsing. I mean, the social security network is in fact, we're in few weeks we might go in an even bigger like hyperinflationary scenario when they lift the subsidy scheme of the fuel, for example. And so far that we are entering into a critical time that the NSSF, the social security network that covers more than 2/3 of the Lebanese, is going to collapse because they cannot sustain it. And then we're going to enter into really shortages of medicine, health crisis, in fact. And this is not a joke. And this is why in the Depositors Union, we think that we need basically a coalition of different social sectors to push for an IMF-backed plan that could bring back some sort of normalcy to the banking sector so that we can kickstart the economy.
Of course, a situation like this needs national support, but on a personal one-to-one basis for an ordinary citizen, Obaida, let's come back to you. We were just talking about how expatriates are able to help support their family and maybe friends through sending money, but are they able to send it through the banking system, or how are people able to, families living overseas, able to help people in Lebanon?
there is still a new channel which they called it the fresh money account, where expats can also support their families, and you have it also through IMT, where you can also send fresh dollars to your family. But as I told you before, even the expats, they are also holding a big burden. So most of the people who are abroad are actually students or people or immigrants who actually went outside to have to support and secure a living. And imagine in this case, they have to support not only their families, but a bigger family back home. So imagine, for example, I always picture it's an area in Tripoli called Tibani, where you have a lot of expats who are sending money, but can they actually support the whole area, which is 10,000 of people who are living in this area? So it's not only the burden, it's also people who are thinking of leaving the country. So they are not only upset, they don't have any other option actually rather than travel. And actually, this is actually the actual loss. It's not about resources, assets. It's actually young people who will go abroad, and how can you actually rebuild the economy without these people? So I believe managing the current situation as the current ruling authority is doing by just relying on support from international organizations, from expats, is not sustainable anymore, and will not be a solution in the upcoming months. So we need to think, and Nizar just told you about maybe the need for a coalition to push for an IMF loan, but what we need more actually is not only a coalition, but a group of parties who can actually pressure the current ruling authority to negotiate a transition of power for a different entity, because the current authority started actually negotiation with the IMF, but they withdrew at the last moment because they found themselves actually losing, especially the banks in this case. And I believe the current ruling authority and the government and all the stakeholders that are around it wouldn't actually care about going into the IMF again unless there is a whole change of power in this country.
So at an organisational level, things need to be sorted out in order for stability to be able to be created. But one of the other problems, ongoing problems, Nizar, is the problem of the black market. And also I'm seeing that even some gas stations, some petrol stations are refusing to take supplies because they're being threatened. And there's a smuggling operation sending fuel outside of the country. Can you tell us about that?
I mean, definitely. Like one of the issues with the fuel is that, of course, the fuel is subsidized. But then, of course, it's more lucrative to sell this same fuel, for example, in Syria for a higher price. So yes, Lebanon has been having a problem with smuggling to Syria, specifically that Syria is under sanctions by the West. And as you may know, Lebanon is de facto ruled by a coalition that is pro-Iranian right now. And one of the reasons why also the financial crisis is so severe is the fact that we lack international legitimacy. Lebanon historically was more neutral in the way it positioned itself politically. This definitely has a toll also on the economy. Regarding the black market, again, as I said, the government is using whatever is left of the national reserves to actually subsidize, fuel and medicine. But at the same time, they didn't change the political economy and the structure of the economy, because this would mean challenging really powerful people. So what is happening is lots of this money, which is eventually the depositors' money, the middle class money, is going back to oligopolies, monopolies that sustain the same corrupt system. I personally don't think that they can sustain this for a long time. They could do it for another 1-2 years, but eventually something must break. Especially so we would reach, I believe, some sort of an agreement eventually, but unfortunately, it would be on the backs of the common people and the middle class specifically, which will lose lots of its deposits. Unless we manage to fight this, as Obaida was saying, through social coalition, through basically sustaining a new balance of power on social terms, by getting a government that is not pro-banks, but in the interest of basically the state and the people. And I believe that this is one of our biggest problems. There's no collective action. There's no idea of public good. The state is, in fact, ruled by a bunch of oligarchs who are just interested in fattening their pockets.
Well, sadly, until that is resolved, it looks as though there's no a realistic way forward. But let's hope that the people are able to find a leadership that can take them forward into the future and resolve these problems. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Tekriti Nizar Ghanem, thank you so much for joining us here today on A News. Thank you. Lebanon is going through severe shortages in gasoline, medicines, both still subsidised by the state, and other vital products. Electricity cuts last for much of the day, and people must wait in line for hours to fill up their cars. Meanwhile, the nation's unemployment rate spiked from 28% in February 2020 to nearly 40% by the end of the year. The dire socio-economic conditions risk systemic national failings with regional and potentially global consequences. The coming months will show which consequences occur. For now, let's move from Lebanon to the Palestinian neighbourhood, Sheikh Jarrah. Sheikh Jarrah is home to around 2,800 Palestinian residents and includes many diplomatic missions and well-known landmarks. Our following infographic gives the main historic facts. Dozens of Israeli settlers stormed into the Al-AQSA mosque complex in occupied East Jerusalem on Wednesday, an act which is carried out on a daily basis.
On Wednesday, scores of Israeli settlers forced their way into the Flashpoint Al-Aqsa mosque complex in occupied East Jerusalem. The Islamic Endowment Department in Jerusalem said in a statement that 74 settlers broke into the compound under the protection of Israeli police. More settlers are expected to enter the site later in the afternoon. Israeli settlers have been storming the Al-Aqsa complex every day except for weekends, Friday for Muslims and Saturday for Israelis. In the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, Israeli forces continue their daily assault against the Palestinian residents using stun grenades and spraying skunk water. The occupation forces stormed yesterday the house of the Khoshe family, raided the residence, and forced the family to leave the house in the middle of the night. Palestinians resist Israel's humiliation and threats of expulsion on a daily basis.
Now joined live from Madaba in Jordan by Dr. Azam Tamimi, who's a Palestinian commentator, and from Jerusalem by Zakaria Udeh, who's a coordinator for the Civil Coalition for Palestinian Rights in Jerusalem. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me today here on The Edge. Dr. Tamimi, the situation in Sheikh Jarrah has not changed. The conflicts are continuing. The Zionists are continuing to storm Al-Aqsa Mosque. What is the current situation as you see it?
Well, the current situation is quite provocative. The actions of the settlers, who are always supported by Israeli security agencies and Israeli army, they will continue to hope to evict the Palestinians who live in this neighborhood. And not just this neighborhood. I mean, we mustn't fool ourselves. I mean, their ambition extends beyond just Sheikh Jarrah. This is a colonial settler displacement sort of colonization project, and they won't rest until they achieve their objective. And the only thing that can prevent them from achieving their objective is the determination of the Palestinians to continue to resist and prevent the seizure of their homes.
Zakaria, we'll come to you. Thank you for joining us. Zakaria, what is the atmosphere? What is the atmosphere in Jerusalem?
You know, I mean, the situation, the atmosphere have been very tense for the last weeks, not only the last weeks, even the last month. Since the beginning of Ramadan, there has been a lot of protest in Damascus Gate, and started in Sheikh Jarrah and spread all over all Jerusalem, the West Bank, and even the historic part of Palestine, 1948. You know, this is as a result of, we're talking about 54 years of Israeli colonial settler apartheid regime. Even it has been for 73 years since Al-Nakba. And now we have been witnessing an escalation by the Israeli settler movement, especially in Sheikh Jarrah. As you know, that Sheikh Jarrah has been facing a forced displacement. There are now 19 households that there is a eviction or the forced displacement order by the Israeli courts. We're expecting at any day that they will be evicted. This is part of the whole neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, which include nearly 72 households that are facing the same fate. You know, it's part of the Israeli settler movement strategy. There is a plan to build a settlement to replace the homes of the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah. So it's not only Sheikh Jarrah that has been targeted by the Israeli government and the Israeli settler movement. There are several neighborhoods. Al-Bustan in Silwan is facing demolition. 120 homes are facing demolition. But in Hawa, nearly 700 people are facing as well forced displacement. Wadi Yasul, Ain al-Loze. So in Silwan only, there are 4 or 5 sub-neighborhoods that either facing forced displacement through eviction or through demolition. So the Israeli government, the Israeli settler movement, have been targeting several Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem. This is part of the bigger plan to Judaize Jerusalem, to Israelize Jerusalem. You know, there is what they call it, the Holy Basin for them. The Holy Basin is the old city, and Silwan in the south, Mount of Olive in the east, and Sheikh Jarrah in the north. So the plan is to control the whole area, to increase the number of settlers and settlement, and to reduce the number of the Palestinians who are living in Jerusalem. This is part of what they call it, the demographic Israeli strategy. A majority of Jewish Israeli people vis-a-vis a small minority of Palestinian population. You know, it's important to talk that Sheikh Jarrah now for 6 weeks has been really closed and sieged by Israeli forces. There has been a checkpoint in all the entrance where they prevent any Palestinian who doesn't live in the neighborhood to access to the city. So the families in Sheikh Jarrah, they can't really communicate with their relatives, with their friends, due to the Israeli closure as well. At the same time, they allow the Israeli Jewish settlers to come and enter the neighborhood to attack the Palestinian families. The police forces have been as well protecting the settlers, and they have been harassing the Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah. This is part of the strategy to put pressure on the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah in order to force them to leave the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah.
Azam, let's come back to you now. It's a very important point that what is described as a real estate dispute over Sheikh Jarrah quite patently is much broader than that. It's not just one area, one neighborhood in Jerusalem, but as Zakaria just explained to us, it's many places, including villages like Beta in the occupied West Bank, where the settlers are expanding. Now, with the new government under Naftali Bennett, is this policy going to expand, or is the reaction of the international community finally going to step up after the bombardments which finished on Gaza just a month ago?
Well, the present government, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, is considered to be more right-wing, more extremist, and therefore there will be no improvement. Things are only likely to escalate, to become worse. This government is led now by a settler movement that doesn't want to see Palestinians anywhere in the land. And I don't think that the international community is likely to do anything unless there is pressure from within Palestine itself on the Israeli occupation, as we saw in the recent confrontation when Gaza came to the aid of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa Mosque and Sheikh Jarrah. I think what the Israelis are doing at the moment is they're as if they're telling the Palestinians, okay, show us what you are going to do. And this is rather silly on their part, because the Palestinians have a lot they can do in order to defend their land and defend their rights. And the Israelis know it very well. But this is the nature of extremism. Extremism blinds, and we saw this in South Africa. Toward the very last few months of apartheid in South Africa, there was an escalation in violence against the people of South Africa, more severe treatment of protesters, more denial of the rights of the indigenous population. It's a mirror image of what the Algerians went through under the French and of what the South African people went through under apartheid. And therefore, I think it's really up to the Palestinians, and I'm sure the Palestinians know this very well, and that's why the activism has not ceded. It continues to be at a high level, as we see from the daily confrontations in Sheikh Jarrah and in various parts of various other parts of Jerusalem.
In fact, one of the things we saw during the recent attacks on Gaza was that Palestinians united by holding a strike action. So it might there be some sort of civil disobedience campaign, and would something like that be effective against the Israeli security forces in a way which protests may not have been?
Well, the resistance can have 100 different faces, and what matters is to resist and to challenge the Israelis in whatever policy they pursue. And we learned this from the experience of other people, as I've just mentioned earlier. I mean, the Algerians would never have been free had they not put up resistance to French colonialism, a very similar settler colonialism, similarly in South Africa. Now, what the next step is likely to be on the part of the Palestinians, I think we might be surprised, just as the world was surprised by the recent confrontation and by the unity that confrontation created among the Palestinians of the 1948, of Jerusalem, of the West Bank, of Gaza, and of the diaspora. I'm truly optimistic. I can see in the brutality the Zionists are practicing against the Palestinians. I see the end of this project approaching, because this is exactly what we saw in similar other projects in the past.
So it's a time for change. Zakaria, let me come back to you. One of the things which was very impressive in the form of the resistance during the bombardments on Gaza for 11 days, which until the end of May, was the citizen journalism that was going on, and how the young people particularly were getting their voice out and motivating groups around the world in the United Kingdom, in the United States and other countries to protest alongside them in their own countries. Is this spirit of spreading the word something which is continuing to grow?
Yeah, I think what really distinguished the protest or the movement, or if we call it the uprising, during the last 2-3 months, that it was really expanded in all parts of Palestine. It started in Jerusalem, expanded to all the West Bank, it expanded to the historic Palestine, to Gaza. It's expanded even to the Palestinians in the diaspora, in the refugee camps in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, even among the Palestinian communities in Europe, in Canada, in the U.S. You know, that's what distinguished that. It has united the people, the protest, the resistance, and it united the geography. You know, we never have witnessed a general strike that what happened in the 10th of May, where all Palestinians between the sea and the river, that they all involve and participate in this general strike. People talking about that, we haven't seen that since 1936, since the general strike in 1936. And you know what's important about that? That the generation which really is leading all these uprisings, is leading this protest, are the young. You know, if you see Jerusalem, if you see Damascus Gate, Sheikh Al Jarrah, the people in the historic Palestine, all of them are really the young, those who are really even less than 23, 22 years old. And that's what really distinguishes that. And that's why we are talking about a new generation, a new leadership for the uprising, for the protest. We hope this will lead to develop a new leadership, and we hope that this will lead to developing a continuous uprising, a continuous protest, and always we talk, I think, what's before the situation, before the uprising is not the same like the situation after the uprising, because there are new elements that have been really involved, and there are new things that has been happening which never happened before, as you said. And this is really what put the Palestinian issue in the top of the agenda after it was in a very difficult and very bad situation before the uprising. We know because the regional situation, the Arab country, all this normalization between some of the Gulf states and the Arab states with Israel for nothing. And so the Palestinian question, the Palestinian situation was really in a very bad situation. But now it went up in the top of the agenda. It became, it put it globally, not only regionally. You know, Sheikh Jarrah, and the issue was the sparking, which really led to all this, that putting the whole issue of Palestinian, the whole conflict, on the top of the agenda globally. There has been a lot of solidarity. There was demonstration, marches in all the European countries, in all the Arab countries, and even in the U.S. and Canada and many other countries, which we haven't seen before. That's why we hope that this will be a start of a continuous, sustainable new mechanism of leadership, resistance, protest that will have an impact in the whole conflict and the whole situation.
A new way forward. Zakaria Odeh, thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge. It's a pleasure speaking with you. Dr. Tamimi, just one of the great needs for Palestine is to have elections, which were postponed recently. The political makeup of the Palestinian territories may have changed over the years. Is there is there a leader or a group that will take all of the Palestinian territories together into the future to unite them and to unite the resistance to resolve this issue from the Palestinian perspective?
Of course, there will always be a group leading the struggle and taking it forward. But I don't think that this needs an election to happen. Election is meaningless under occupation. It is even more meaningless when it is conducted by an authority that is collaborating with the occupation itself. Naturally, any election conducted in such a situation will be aimed to produce the same sort of leadership, a leadership that sees eye to eye with the occupation rather than with the victims of the occupation. The leadership of the Palestinian people will always be those who lead the struggle, those who lead the resistance and who lead the steadfastness.
So what is necessary to break out of this cycle in order to, if the Palestinian Authority is under the sway of the Israelis, what is necessary to break out of that cycle and bring about the Palestinian statehood that I think is what you're suggesting is necessary to move forwards?
Well, the only way is to undo the results of the Oslo deal between the PLO and Israel. What we see today in the West Bank of fragmentation, of the confiscation of land, the demolition of houses, the arbitrary detentions, all happened because of the outcome of the Oslo deal between the PLO and Israel. And this has to be reversed. It has to be undone. We need to go back to the days of the first Intifada, the uprising of 1987. This is what the Palestinians need and what will unite them. And again, it's not a question of statehood. The people of Palestine need to be free. Once they are free from the shackles of occupation, then they can decide what they want to do with themselves. So what's the point of having a state that is not sovereign, that is dependent on foreign aid, that is dependent on occupation, and whose primary role is to support the occupation and to maintain it? It's not a question of a state, it's a question of freedom. We Palestinians need to be free from occupation.
So in order to bring that about, obviously there's been lots of interference from over the last century. We can go back for years and years. The interference from countries like the United Kingdom, like America and others, jumbling up the situation. How will, I assume that some sort of conference would still need to be brought about for a suitable treaty to be established to fully establish Palestine, but who is going to be able to make that happen in a way which is credible for all?
Well, first of all, the role of the Western powers wasn't just about interfering or intervening. It was about creating the state of Israel. It was about bringing Zionism into Palestine at the expense of the Palestinian people, so that the Zionist entity can act as an outpost for Western colonialism. Now, this will have to go through the same stages of struggle as we saw in similar projects before. And it is the Palestinians who will force the international community and also force the regional powers, some of which actually protect Israel day and night, including the Arab states that made peace with Israel. It is the Palestinians, through their struggle and steadfastness, that will force them to dissociate themselves from Zionism. Once this dissociation begins, as happened with apartheid in South Africa, then we will begin to see light in the end of the tunnel.
Well, we remember the struggle from the 80s in South Africa with apartheid, and that was overcome. We will see what happens, and hopefully it will be overcome soon in Palestine. Dr. Azam Tamimi, thank you so much for joining me again here today on The Edge. Sheikh Jarrah has been the focus and the scene of frequent crackdowns by Israeli forces on Palestinians protesting the threatened forced expulsion of dozens of Palestinian families from their homes. The ceasefire took effect on the 21st of May, but the long-running campaign by Jewish settlers to expel Palestinians from their homes continues. It seems as if the violence against Palestinians will continue. We hope the reaction from the international community might soon stop the atrocities against Palestinians. For now, let's move on to another conflict-ridden country, namely Libya. On the 5th of February, Libya's rival political groups agreed in UN-mediated talks to form an interim unity government to lead the country to elections this December. Our following infographic explains the process. So the new interim government elected in February will run the country until polls on the 24th of December, when Libyans are due to freely elect their next administration. We hope that it will bring peace and stability to the region. Now, our analysts have provided their insights on today's top stories. Let's have a roundup of what they had to say. Before closing our programme, let's take a look at social media to hear your voices and reactions on today's top story, shared with the hashtag Sheikh Jarrah. And here's what you had to say about Sheikh Jarrah on Twitter. Allah Hamuda says this is a war inside Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. Settlers and Israeli police officers are attacking Palestinians at their homes. This must end. Stop Israeli terrorists. And Laith Hanbali says this is why, as soon as ceasefire was announced, Palestinians said cease apartheid, cease settler colonialism, cease siege. This is why there's ongoing resistance in Silwan. Sheikh Jarrah Beta. It's Palestinians defending their homes and themselves from being ethnically cleansed. And Stand Up for Palestine said Iyad Abu Jaish, an activist who was arrested last night while covering the night confusion event East Beit Jajan, Nablus. Iyad was brutally beaten whilst being arrested and detained. Let's now take a look at our video of the day, which tells the story of a Palestinian mother and her 3 sons who are suffering from the attacks in Gaza.
أول ما صارت الضربة كانوا كلهم نايمين، ثاني ضربة قطعت الكهرباء عندنا بالبرج. رحنا حضننا الأولاد وانضربت الضربة الثالثة قلنا خلص على البيت. انهز البيت، وقع الإزاز، صوت هيك ضغط الهواء لما يخش في ودانك وفي البيت، قلت خلص لقيت علينا. سمعنا جيراننا بيصرخوا علينا وعلى البرج، احنا لقيت استوعبنا انه خلص لسه البرج ما انقصفش، كل واحد اخذ شنطته ونزل، كلنا جرينا ورحنا على الأونروا. اولادي يعني تقريبا نفسيتهم تعبت، يعني صار لما يسمع اي صوت خلص يحط ايديه على ودانه ويقعد هيك. لقيت صار كل تفكيري اولادي، حياتي كيف اعيشهم لقدام، بس اتخيلش المستقبل البعيد لانه الواحد مش ضامن حاله.
And that's all for this episode of The Edge with me, Andy Boyns. Stay tuned as we'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth analysis on the top stories and a look beyond the edge.